You're joining us on this Wednesday. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to the Faculty Spotlight event series brought to you by the Johns Hopkins University Master of Liberal Arts and the Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features Dr. Adam Culver discussing Sophocles and James Baldwin and how it sheds light on contemporary racial politics. My name is Peter Huggins and I'm the event producer. Please note, today's program will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Master of Liberal Arts playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function and we will answer as many questions as possible toward the second half of the event. With that, I will turn over the event to the host of our program, Dr. Tristan Cabello.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Tristan Cabello, and I'm the Associate Director for the Master of Liberal Arts here at Johns Hopkins University. Tonight is the fourth event of our Faculty Spotlight series, which will run during the whole spring semester. In this series, we are showcasing the diversity of courses that you can take in the Master of Liberal Arts, but also the research that our faculty members are doing. So as you know, the Master of Liberal Arts is an interdisciplinary program. You can therefore take courses in many different disciplines, such as music, literature, gender studies, sociology, and you can also take courses in political theory with one of our professors, Dr. Adam Culver, who is presenting today. Dr. Culver teaches many courses in the MLA program, such as modern Black political thought, for example. He's a political theorist. He received his PhD from Johns Hopkins University. His research explores the legacies of the emergence of modernity, the elaboration of racial hierarchy, and Black emancipatory politics. His current book project is entitled Race and Romantic Visions, a Tragic Reading. It explores a series of creative intersections between Romanticism, modern Black political thought, and philosophies of tragic possibility through the readings of Kant, James Baldwin, Du Bois, Toni Morrison, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Sophocles. So Dr. Culver is going to give a 35 minute talk presentation, and we'll have a few minutes at the end for questions. Adam, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cabello, for that very friendly and generous introduction. I've been with advanced academic programs now for, I believe, over 5 years. It's been really awesome to watch the program grow in excellence and in breadth. And so it's a real honor to be presenting some of my research here today, which sort of emerges out of this book project. So what I'll be talking about today is a sort of condensed version of part of that project. Share. Okay, so my remarks today will be roughly divided into 4 sections. In the first introductory section, I'll provide a broad overview of my argument and elaborate in particular what I find to be some rather striking and significant affinities between the tragic sensibilities or worldviews expressed in the Theban plays of Sophocles and in the nonfiction essays of James Baldwin. Each of the next 3 sections will be organized around a key figure in the tragic dramas of Sophocles. In the first, I'll discuss how Sophocles uses Oedipus to exemplify the human predicament and how Baldwin draws upon this figuration to emphasize in particular the ways in which the past endures into the present, refusing in a sense to become past, particularly through the shaping of subconscious registers of affect, feeling, and sensibility. Then in the next section, I'll highlight significant analogs between Sophocles' blind seer Tiresias and Baldwin's figure of the creative artist, both of whom are in a sense tasked with revealing to a society its disavowed otherness, and often to pay a terrible price for doing so. In the final section, I'll show how Baldwin finds affinities between the uncompromising posture of Antigone and the mode of Black politics he he deems necessary in the wake of the destruction of the Second Reconstruction, or as he puts it, that betrayed and co-opted insurrection that American folklore has trivialized into the civil rights movement. I want to begin my remarks here with reference to two events that I think neatly encapsulate the Trump presidency and exemplify the current ascendancy of white power politics in the United States: the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the Capitol insurrection in Washington, D.C. I begin with these not only because they bookend the Trump presidency and typify the sentiment of white grievance and mob rule animating it, and sadly, much of American life today, but also because the reactions these events provoked exemplify a tendency among many white Americans to narrate the history of race in America as a story of progress and redemption, as one in which the conduct of the nation is steadily brought in line with its guiding principles of liberty, freedom, and the unfettered pursuit of individual dreams for all. So, for example, after Charlottesville, one finds figures like former Republican Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, denouncing white supremacy on Twitter as a scourge, contrary to all this country stands for, while January 6th was followed by a deluge of political punditry declaring, "This is not America." Now, to be sure, such claims may reflect noble impulses and can involve drawing upon aspects of the American tradition that can be mobilized to affirm and strive for the realization of racial justice and a genuinely democratic polity. However, by disavowing the deep historical entanglements between white supremacy and American political practices and values, claims of this sort, whether delivered in bad faith or out of some sort of liberal goodwill, reinforce what James Baldwin called a dangerous and reverberating silence, a silence which shrouds the racialized character of the polity under a cloak of American innocence, hiding from view those more troubling traditions that form a part of American identity. In this way, then, denunciations of white supremacy that do not also account for its centrality in shaping American identities in the past and present ultimately contribute to the retrenchment of white supremacist systems and logics in the United States. Against this tendency, I propose the adoption of an untimely approach, one which, as Gilles Deleuze puts it, operates both within time and against time, so that we can come to terms with these historical processes without allowing them to define and delimit who we take ourselves to be and what we imagine to be possible. To that end, I explore a series of untimely affinities between the works of Sophocles and Baldwin in order to articulate a tragic vision of an unbalanced world, neither governed by providence nor susceptible to human mastery or control. Doing so, as I hope to show over the next 25 minutes or so, helps to both clarify key contours of contemporary US racial politics, particularly by illuminating subterranean anxieties animating white racial identity formation, and highlight an important politically generative aspect of Baldwin's thought, namely his essential and enduring commitment to existential affirmation as an indispensable component of both human flourishing in general and the struggle against white supremacy in particular. Against the idea of a world predisposed to correspond with human values, capabilities, or intentions, a tragic vision posits a world without intrinsic purpose, transcendental guidance, or what Michel Foucault calls prediscursive providence, which disposes the world in our favor. Whereas providential visions see human beings as comfortably in control of their own destinies or as part of a larger plan or purpose, tragedians like Sophocles and indeed Baldwin warn that humans can rely upon neither their own powers of reason nor the assistance of a divine power to establish a secure place in the world and a stable sense of self. In other words, rather than assuring an integrated self and control of a structured world, tragedy presents that self, and the structures which surround it and emanate from it as continually threatened by dissolution. Yet a tragic vision does not thereby advocate abandoning worldly engagement in the pursuit of social transformation. It is not a form of quietism. Instead, its best moments warn that such efforts, while necessary, are inherently uncertain and always vulnerable to forces beyond human comprehension or control. These forces of uncertainty and instability do not provide an alibi for inaction. They are rather inescapable conditions for action as such. In urging respect for the contingent, paradoxical, and unpredictable in life, tragic wisdom thus teaches a lesson not of passive resignation, but of modesty, responsiveness, and activism, out of which a noble ethic of solidarity and care for the world may arise. The point of tragic wisdom is to help us better care for the world, not abandon it. In order to grasp how white supremacy has become embedded at seemingly every level of American life, Baldwin credits the importance of mining the historical bedrock of American institutions, interests, and ideologies that are the typical purview of the social sciences. But he also suggests that we need to go beneath the source, beneath the surface, to tap the source. By exploring registers of attitude and affect, habit and belief, and identity and disposition. For, as he says, the political institutions of any nation are always menaced and are ultimately controlled by the spiritual state of the nation. It is at the level of spiritual and existential investigation into the dynamics of whiteness and anti-Black racism that tragic wisdom offers critical insights for students of racial politics. There is, I suggest, a profound spiritual affinity between Sophocles and Baldwin, both of whom see civilization as a fragile construction that shields human beings from elemental chaos. The entire purpose of society, Baldwin writes, is to create a bulwark against the inner and the outer chaos, literally, in order to make life bearable and to keep the human race alive. The construction is fragile in part because the banisters of thought and practice through which societies are held together are always provisional. Its fragility is exacerbated by the human tendency to grow attached to these supports, to treat what is provisional as intrinsic or true. This is why the creative artist, according to Baldwin, has a responsibility to reveal the primordial chaos lurking beneath all social structures, and to bear witness to those forces within us which perpetually menace our precarious security. Likewise, the tragic plays of Sophocles problematized the categories and norms underlying Athenian civic life, confounded the divisions and inequities deemed necessary for orderly social reproduction, and warned the audience that there is no stable horoscope for man. Evoking this sensibility, Baldwin proposes the following. Society must accept some things as real, but the artist must always know that the visible reality hides a deeper one, and that all our action and all our achievement rests on things unseen. A society must assume that it is stable, but the artist must know, and he must let us know that there is nothing stable under heaven. For the truth, in spite of appearances and all our hopes, is that everything is always changing. And the measure of our maturity as nations and as men is how well prepared we are to meet these changes and further to use them for our health. For Sophocles and Baldwin alike, then, a tragic vision entails an awareness of the contingent, time-bound nature of existence, of the ways in which human beings are caught up in the inexorable flux of creation and destruction that gives shape to the world, and of the constitutive powers of a past we can never fully escape. Understanding that Americans are capable of living with far more racial injustice than they are comfortable admitting, Baldwin identified the obstacles to multiracial democracy that bedeviled both his time and our own. Illuminating subterranean anxieties animating white racial identity formation, Baldwin suggests that racial hierarchy and domination in the United States are symptomatic of a pervasive and deeply ingrained refusal among white Americans to acknowledge, let alone affirm, the tragic character of existence, a refusal that often manifests as a disclaiming of the past and of the force of history, as one of the most American of attributes, the inability, Baldwin says, to believe that time is real. Baldwin thus proffers a symptomatic reading of whiteness, highlighting the existential and elemental, the affective and visceral, subterranean and subconscious, spiritual and dispositional dimensions of white supremacy that are not often sufficiently captured by prevailing conceptions of compensatory whiteness within critical race studies, which tend to emphasize the way whiteness assuages fears about downward social mobility or economic insecurity, as we like to call it today, by assuring whites of a guaranteed social standing derived from their status as not Black. One might lose everything, but not whiteness, as Du Bois famously remarked in Black Reconstruction. Supplementing this account, I aim to call attention to how whiteness also compensates for ontological uncertainties and assuages existential fears and anxieties by assuring whites of the fundamental validity of their moral beliefs, values, and self-perceptions. The human struggle to master a world not of our own making and the consequences of pursuing that struggle too far are foundational themes in Greek tragedy. And no figure in Greek drama more powerfully and tragically embodies the paradoxes of man's civilizing power than Oedipus, whose imperious quest for self-mastery ends in self-destruction, prompting the choral lament. Yours the text, yours the spell. I see it in you, Oedipus, man's pattern of unblessedness. Oedipus exemplifies the predicament of living and acting in an unbalanced world composed of diverse forces or gods that do not always harmonize with one another or correspond to human intentions. But it would be a mistake to see Oedipus's downfall as the result solely of factors external to himself, an inhospitable world, hostile gods, or an inescapable fate decreed in advance. For Oedipus is driven towards his tragic fate through his insistence on escaping his past and being the sovereign master of his own destiny. In so doing, Oedipus seals his doom and blindly acts out his own fate. He is mastered by his own quest for mastery. Man's civilizing power and destructive capacity are in this sense one and the same. The impulse towards tyranny, Peter Euban suggests, comes not simply from what is basest in us, but from what is most admirable, our drive for political and intellectual order, our power to define and bound the world in ways that provide both certainty and security. Hence, Oedipus is double, hero and scapegoat. In one of his earliest essays, Many Thousands Gone, Baldwin invokes the enigmatic figure of Oedipus in order to call attention to the inscrutability of life and, more specifically, to dramatize the inescapable force of the past to a white citizenry whose disbelief in the reality of time rendered them as blind to the self-defeating vanities of their own self-making as poor Oedipus. In our image of the Negro breathes the past we deny, not dead, but living yet and powerful, the beast in our jungle of statistics. It is a sentimental error, therefore, to believe that the past is dead. It means nothing to say that it is all forgotten, that the Negro himself has forgotten it. It is not a question of memory. Oedipus did not remember the thongs that bound his feet. Nevertheless, the marks they left testified to that doom towards which his feet were leading him. The man does not remember the hand that struck him, the darkness that frightened him as a child. Nevertheless, the hand and the darkness remain with him, indivisible from himself forever, part of the passion which drives him wherever he thinks to take flight. With Oedipus as his untimely example, Baldwin contends that we cannot escape our past, or we cannot escape our origins, however hard we try. Which does not mean, however, that we are subject to a historical determinism according to which the past would dictate entirely the future. Rather, Baldwin seeks to highlight the various ways that the past continues to frame and breathe life into the present, not only through inherited institutions and memorialized history, but also through the shaping of subconscious registers of affect, feeling, and sensibility. In other words, the past not only shapes the contours of the present through what P.J. Brandisi calls active memory, the memory of those pasts that can be consciously recalled on demand, written into history, or even commissioned by political institutions, but also, and perhaps more importantly, through registers of habit memory, which concern the ways in which the past tacitly frames and informs our experiences, passions, unconscious assumptions, biases, and aversions in ways that operate below the horizon of conscious awareness. It is on these subtler, more subterranean registers of thought and experience that the scripts for what Eddie Glaude Jr. calls our racial habits are composed. These habits are the customs of everyday life through which Americans live and embody the value gap, the belief that white lives matter more than the lives of others. Because the value gap is lived and embodied in our racial habits, which often remain unarticulated, it can persist even as it is explicitly disclaimed at the level of conscious thought and public discourse. In fact, post-racial proclamations, claims that we are over that now, put it all behind us, are likely to strengthen the subterranean power these beliefs, habits, and categories exert over our lives. In addition to dramatizing the consequences of the human tendency to disclaim complexity and contingency, the tragic plays of Sophocles also frequently depict and decry the tendency of the powerful to insist on the categorical authority of their own beliefs, priorities, and values. We see this dynamic play out in the Antigone with special intensity in the interaction between Creon, now ruler of Thebes following the civil war between the sons of Oedipus, both of whom perished in the struggle for control of the city, and the wine seer Tiresias, who up to this point had been a most trusted confidant and advisor to Creon. But now Tiresias warns Creon that Creon's conflict with Antigone, daughter of Oedipus and bride-to-be of Creon's son Haemon, who has publicly disobeyed Creon's order that the body of her brother Polynices be denied the sanctification of holy rites and instead remain on the battlefield unburied and unmourned, quote, a corpse for dogs to maul and vultures to pick his bones, end quote, has placed Creon and the city, quote, once again on the razor's edge. Creon does not simply ignore Tiresias' warning. Instead, he lashes out at the old seer, accusing him of lying for pecuniary gain, insinuating that Tiresias' prophecy has been purchased with a bribe by the enemies of Thebes. The more Tiresias forewarns and implores Creon to change course, the more obstinate Creon becomes, cursing Tiresias as a surreptitious partisan, venal opportunist, or doddering old fool, anything to discredit yet another challenge to his sovereign authority. Announcing truths that the powerful willfully disavow, it is no wonder that seers like Tiresias are often objects of contempt and scorn in Greek tragedy. Capable of seeing the invisible underlying forces at work in a world that continually exceeds and confounds the categories we initially bring to it, they reveal discomforting truths, reminding us that much of what we assume to be natural, fundamental, and definitive in this world is in fact artificial, provisional, and ambiguous. Moreover, the similarities between Sophocles' seer and Baldwin's artist are evident. Both are tasked with the responsibility to bear witness to human finitude, to reveal to a society its disavowed otherness, and to drive to the heart of every answer and expose the question the answer hides, as Baldwin puts it. Moreover, Baldwin contends that Black Americans play an analogous spiritual role in American life insofar as they, that is, Black Americans, continually disrupt and prevent the spiritual and social ease of white Americans. This has everything to do, Baldwin says, with the way white Americans continually reinvest the Blackface with our guilt, thereby endowing it with the power to operate as a most disagreeable mirror, reflecting an appallingly oppressive and bloody history and a disastrous continuing present condition. defending themselves against the witness of history and the testimony of the present. Those who think of themselves as white, Baldwin says, have internalized a fantastic system of evasions, denials, and justifications, and as a result, have begun to lose touch with reality, to lose touch, that is, with themselves. According to Baldwin, then, white dominion is sustained through rituals of disavowal, whereby domination is simultaneously enacted and disclaimed in a dynamic he ironically calls innocence, by which he means a kind of existential orientation or ethos, animated by willful disavowals of finitude, ambiguity, temporality, and our inescapable entanglements with others. In each regard, as George Shulman writes, innocence is a dream of safety and purity, by imagining a sovereignty not subject to sentience and need, history and others, loss and death. But such a dream is only possible if one is able to protect oneself, project one's fears, misfortunes, and sufferings onto others. What is meant to be a Negro in this country, Baldwin explains, is that you represent, you are the receptacle of all and the vehicle of all the pain, disaster, sorrow, which white Americans think they can escape. This is really what is meant by keeping the Negro in his place. Presenting whiteness as the paradigmatic case of innocence, Baldwin depicts the rigid, categorical attachment to whiteness and racial hierarchy as a form of what William E. Connolly calls ontological compensation for contingency in a world replete with paradox, uncertainty, and ceaseless change. A safe harbor, a certain warm narrowness, as Nietzsche puts it, where white Americans can feel secure and at home in an otherwise insecure world, confident in their sense of self-worth and moral superiority. For no matter how terrible some of their lives may be, Baldwin remarks, there is one consolation, like a heavenly revelation, at least they are not Black. Baldwin's insight that white supremacy is fundamental to many whites' sense of self and world helps us to understand the vigilance and vengefulness with which the boundary lines of America's racial order have been policed and maintained throughout the history of the Republic. I believe that at a subterranean level, many whites are haunted by the suspicion that their ideas of progress, freedom, and virtue are bankrupt. They resent that very suspicion and seek targets upon whom to vent that resentful energy, targets to blame for a deeper disacknowledgement they cannot acknowledge. Blackness thus becomes an object for the projection of irrational fears and a target for the venting of ressentiment, a convenient scapegoat to blame for life's misfortunes and disappointments. However, Baldwin also attends to how white efforts to maintain innocence induce high levels of anguish, guilt, and private despair among white Americans, even suggesting that despite the array of brutalities to which Black Americans have been subjected, what has happened to those who believe themselves to be white is, in some ways, much, much worse. For their moral lives, he says, have been destroyed by the plague of color. Fearfully huddled together in the spiritually arid wasteland of whiteness, white Americans, Baldwin warns, have lost touch with reality and no longer know how to be sensual, that is, how to respect and rejoice in the force of life itself, and to be present in all that one does, from the effort of loving to the breaking of bread. Unable to affirm the vitality of life in a universe of tragic possibility, they have become truly joyless, detached from reality, and incapable of renewing themselves at the fountain of their own lives. Trapped by a disavowed past and a disdained present, they find themselves unable to participate without rancor in the processes of change and creation, giving shape and feeling to the world. Because they refuse to suffer, white Americans have yet to learn how to dance. In an open letter from 1970 to scholar activist Angela Y. Davis, written while she was incarcerated awaiting trial on charges of conspiracy, kidnapping, and homicide, for which she was, of course, ultimately acquitted, Baldwin ruefully concludes that the white conscience Dr. King and other movement leaders had hoped and worked so tirelessly to arouse was ultimately unreachable. We cannot awaken the sleeper, and God knows we have tried, he laments. Indeed, by this point, earlier hopes for interracial reconciliation now appeared utterly illusory to him. For by the end of the 1960s, Baldwin observed that white America remains unable to believe that Black America's grievances are real. They are unable to believe this because they cannot face what this fact says about themselves and their country. No longer able to call upon Blacks to transform the achievements of the West and save America from sterility as he had in the Fire Next Time, Baldwin's affirmative political focus shifts from the late 1960s on to an investigation of diverse practices of collective development and self-realization among Black Americans. He does so in order partly to foster creative possibilities for collective transformation within the tragic conditions of racialized modernity, broadly speaking, and partly as a means of Black self-defense against an increasingly vindictive white supremacist social order and political system. We must do what we can do, he writes to Davis, and fortify and save each other. And yet, Baldwin also writes to Davis that for the sake of themselves, their children, and indeed their country, Black Americans have no choice but to contend, even with inexorable forces, in order to change our fate and the fate of our children and the condition of the world. This statement seems to me to be a rather precise articulation of the situation faced by the tragic hero as portrayed by Sophocles, particularly Antigone in the Antigone, who finds herself face to face with the inexorable force of absolutist political authority. It is noteworthy then that in his last book-length work of nonfiction, The Evidence of Things Unseen, Baldwin's reportage cum meditation on the Atlantic child murders of the late 1970s and early 80s, Baldwin returns again to the tragic dramas of Sophocles, echoing an earlier suggestion from the 1963 essay, The Artist's Struggle for Integrity, that these works, these tragic works, convey something about love, life, and death that many white Americans have difficulty apprehending, let alone affirming, namely, that all safety is an illusion. Whereas on the other hand, in his 1964 essay, The Uses of the Blues, Baldwin remarks that Black Americans, contrary to believing in safety, quote, know what it is to suffer and are far beyond any hope of innocence. Moreover, in The Evidence of Things Unseen, Baldwin makes a striking parallel between the character of Antigone and Camille Bell, one of the mothers of Atlanta's murdered children, who brought attention to the existence of, as Baldwin puts it, a plague raging in the city too busy to hate, through her formation and tireless activism at the forefront of the Committee to Stop Children's Murder. He remarks that not only Bell's intransigence vis-a-vis a state apparatus invested in denying the existence of such a plague, but even her presumption to take any position at all were as subversive as the action, example, and premise of Antigone, and made her a reviled character among the political establishment and much of the respectable citizenry of Atlanta. What I want to call attention to here in the last few moments of my presentation is that Baldwin's late remarks on tragedy illuminate a perhaps underappreciated dimension of tragedy's import for democratic politics and a racialized polity, such as the United States. That existential affirmation is needed not only to work against drives to revenge that stalk political life in a world of tragic possibility, but also to sustain organized struggles against racialized systems of domination and exploitation. Such a reading of Baldwin recasts received interpretations of tragedy's potential contributions to racial politics today. Critical engagements with the tragic vision and its relation to racial politics have tended to focus on that vision's counsel of modesty, forbearance, and receptivity, with critics worrying that these represent a concession to, or at the very least fail to adequately counter, the forces striving to maintain and even heighten racial hierarchies today. But what has received less attention is the extent to which tragic wisdom's counsel to affirm life amid the ineliminable element of injustice it entails, fosters the strength and determination needed to struggle against those very injustices. One of Baldwin's lessons then is that the political import of tragic wisdom exceeds the modesty, openness to difference, and presumptive generosity it might engender among the beneficiaries of an existing political hierarchy. For Baldwin, nothing less than the history of Black perseverance, resistance, and beauty attests that a tragic ethos is also essential among those who suffer unjustly from such hierarchies. For, Baldwin contends, it is the ethos most apt to keep the struggles, in this case, the struggle for racial justice, alive. It demands great force and cunning, Baldwin remarks, continually to assault the mighty and indifferent fortress of white supremacy, as Negroes in this country have done so long. It takes great spiritual resilience, he continues, not to hate the hater whose foot is on your neck. Of course, it is both reasonable and just to hate the hater whose foot is on your neck. Yet Baldwin counsels that even in the face of relentless ugliness and cruelty, some element of acceptance is needed if the fight against ugliness and cruelty is to go on. Thus, he says, one must hold in the mind forever two seemingly opposed ideas: the acceptance, totally without rancor, of life as it is and men as they are, which involves the idea that injustice is commonplace. But this does not mean, Baldwin argues, that one can be complacent, for the second idea is of equal power, that one must never in one's own life accept these injustices as commonplace, but must fight with all one's strength. This fight begins, he says, in the heart, and it entails keeping the heart free of hatred and despair. Baldwin's insight into what I call the elemental dimension of tragedy's counsel to political actors projects a more expansive vision of tragedy's contribution to democratic politics and a racialized polity such as the United States. Baldwin teaches that in a world of tragic possibility, affirmation is needed not only to work against the urge to vent one's disappointments and frustrations upon others, but also to fuel collective struggle against the ingrained and institutionalized forms of such ventilation, against, that is to say, white supremacy. Part of Baldwin's lesson then is that the political always involves an aspect of the elemental. White Americans seek ontological compensation in anti-Black racism. Efforts to promote racial justice demand existential affirmation, if in different forms and in different ways, from all who participate in them. Hence, Baldwin writes, this is why one must say yes to life and embrace it wherever it is found. And it is found in terrible places. Nevertheless, there it is. And if the father can say, yes, Lord, then the child can learn that most difficult of words. Amen.
So much, Adam, for a great presentation here, very much needed. And so we have several questions here from the audience, but I want to start with a more personal question here. And this is often a question that is of interest to our students is, what's the genesis of this project? How did you get interested into this? How did it all started?
Yeah, so, I mean, one could trace it back quite far, right? If one wanted to, all the way to childhood, I suppose, right? But in a more academic sense, its immediate genesis was in my PhD classes at Johns Hopkins. I wrote a joint paper for a class taught by William Connolly on I believe on Kant and Sophocles, and a paper for a class by Michael Hanchard on modern Black political thought, in which they let me combine the papers. I used David Scott's Conscripts of Modernity as a kind of suturing point to bring these sort of two worlds together. And this really led to my dissertation. And so this project comes out of that. And more generally, it comes out of a lifelong kind of interest in trying to figure out racial hierarchy, trying to figure out what it is that makes people, where this idea of superiority comes from, and how to address it.
Several questions from the audience here for you, Adam. First question from Carlos. Baldwin speaks on the proximity of whiteness and how clinging to innocent ideals of white dominion distorts reality. Does Baldwin explicitly mark this as a tragic loss of identity, an abandonment of authenticity, or perhaps both?
I'm not sure to what extent Baldwin explicitly draws upon the language of authenticity, although I think certainly he could be read in that way. I think he does explicitly mark this as a tragic loss of identity, or more precisely as a tragic loss of the failure to create oneself, right? For Baldwin, we were always a stranger to ourselves. Yeah. And part of the task of being human is to create oneself out of the material of life, right? And to the extent that one becomes divorced from life, right, by interposing between oneself and life these distorting mirrors and evasions and beliefs, right, then one loses an ability to create oneself. I think that's where Baldwin sees the issue, and it's why he will frequently refer to America as a sort of shapeless country, right? He'll say, America, if there is an America, right? American identity, if such a thing exists, because racial, the haven, right? He says, the price of havens is high, right? And part of that price is the failure to walk out into the world and kind of undergo the sorts of experiences required to create oneself.
Yeah. And there's a question here by Chrissy that I would have asked myself actually too. Much of this seems to anticipate and explain the fight against teaching critical race theory in schools because it will make kids feel bad about being white. And I'd love to hear your thought about this. Why has the idea of teaching accurate racial history so enraged the same people who claim that facts don't care about your feelings?
Yeah. So, this is something I've been thinking about a lot, of course, as I'm teaching modern Black political thought, right? A few weeks ago, we read an essay by Ida B. Wells on the 1917 East St. Louis massacre, right? An essay which at the time was censored, right, by the War Department. It's sort of interesting to think about that text being censored now today. And I actually, among the sort of photos that I was choosing for my slides, there were some sort of jokes about, the sort of this hysteria about critical race theory. I mean, I think part of it is bad faith. Our bad faith arguments about, that in some ways kind of reflect this the same kind of white power mob mentality, right, that we saw on display on January 6th, right? That despite, that in the end, right, what matters is the sort of assertion of whiteness and this assertion of power. I think that there's also, of course, a very mistaken idea of what these texts are about what this literature does, right? And of course, the very term critical race theory is misapplied in these cases. Critical race theory, refers to a very specific set of literature and legal studies, right? Derek Bell and those associated with him, right? And really, what's talked about with critical race is really any kind of critical examination of race as such, right? And I think that it has to do, ultimately with power, right? An attempt to maintain hierarchies and to keep others powerless. I wish I had a better answer to this question. I'll blame the time difference and it being
yeah, I forgot to mention for the audience that, but your answer is quite on point here, and I forgot to mention to the audience that you are currently located in Copenhagen, and so it's the beginning of the night there, but what I want to say is thank you so much for presenting this to us. I mean, that was a wonderful presentation. We have many more questions, but I'm going to encourage, because we're running out of time, the students and the attendees to ask those questions to you directly via email. And I want to tell the attendees that I thank them for attending tonight. We have 2 more events, I think, coming up in the spring semester with the Faculty Spotlight series, and invitation are, of course, coming up your way. So thank you so much for attending tonight. Thank you so much, Adam. Everybody is thanking you also, as you can see on the chat, for your talk tonight. Everybody have a good night, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much. Bye.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, please do email me with your questions. Kara, I'd love to answer your question about Afro-pessimism. But yes, have a great night, everyone. And thank you, Tristan, and thank you to everybody who came out. Thank you so much.
Thank you.